Tonight, we won't walk the corridors of castles or explore the silence of forgotten monasteries. No, tonight, we will walk the roads. Not the grand, cobbled roads of kings and processions, but the narrow, muddy lanes travelled by a very different kind of figure. Someone alone, someone with a ledger, a pouch, and a very good reason to keep looking over their shoulder. You see, in medieval times, there was one kind of person who seemed to have all the power and none of the peace. He rode not as a knight, nor preached as a monk, but collected something far less romantic than honour or salvation. He came for silver, for chickens, for sacks of grain. He came to collect taxes, but the truth is, he was often less welcome than a storm, and his name was whispered with a bitter breath in cottages across the land. Tonight, we follow him. Through cold mornings, tense encounters, and nights where sleep came only lightly, if at all. We learn what it was really like to be a medieval tax collector, not the villain of the tale, but a man trying to do a job in a world that hated what he stood for. And as we settle in the quiet space between then and now, let us begin. Gently, steadily, as always. Let's step back in time and walk the worn paths of those who were feared, followed, and sometimes never seen again. Why being a medieval tax collector was dangerous. Imagine yourself waking before dawn. Not in a warm bed, but in a rented room above a tavern where the fire has long since gone out. Your clothes smell faintly of travel, of dust, damp wool, and the faintest trace of ink. You sit on the edge of the cot, running your fingers across the leather flap of your satchel. Inside are the tools of your trade, a tally stick, a quill, a small knife for cutting wax seals, and several parchment rolls that bear the king's crest. You're a tax collector, and today you must ride into a village that has already seen you once this season. It's a delicate balance. You do not wear a sword, though some do. You don't travel with soldiers, though you might wish to. You're not a nobleman, not quite, but you bear the weight of noble demands, and every door you knock on will open with wary eyes, downturned mouths, and a silence that holds questions you can't answer. In the Middle Ages, taxes came in many forms. Sometimes it was a coin, a silver penny if one had it. Sometimes it was produce, oats, onions, a chicken, a sheaf of wheat. Other times it was labour, a peasant ordered to leave his fields for a week to repair the Lord's fence or dig ditches. But whatever the form, it was rarely welcomed. You see, tax collectors were not merely unpopular. They were often considered symbols of all that was unjust. To the villagers, you represented hunger. You represented the missing loaf at supper, or the pig they had to slaughter early. You stood for lords who never set foot in the village, and kings who lived in stone halls far away, and yet you were not rich. You were not powerful, not really. The job of a tax collector was filled not with bribes and luxury, but with tension, paperwork, and danger. The pay was modest, the expectations high, the rules complex. You had to memorize exemptions, who was too poor to pay, who had served in war and been granted relief, which lands belonged to the church and were thus untouchable. Mistakes were costly, to the people and to you, because when things went wrong, they did not complain to your superiors. They gathered, quietly, sometimes with pitchforks. There are records, not many, but enough, that tell of tax collectors disappearing, beaten, robbed, or simply never returning from around. Sometimes their satchels were found on the roadside, sometimes not even that. And so, you learned the soft arts of diplomacy. You spoke gently, you tried to smile, you visited the alewife first, bought a drink or two, and asked how the village fared this season. You took the temperature of the place, of the air, of the eyes, because if it was a hungry winter or a sickly spring, then you might think twice before raising your pen. Still, you had quotas, and behind you stood your own superiors, reeves, bailiffs, sheriffs, and behind them the crown. So you did your job, slowly, carefully, one cottage at a time, one cold, wary face after another. And as you mounted your horse at day's end, if you still had your horse, you would breathe in the silence of the road, not as peace, but as relief. Because this time, you made it out. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when quiet desperation became a march. Let us remain a little longer on these quiet medieval roads, the ones worn smooth by hooves and handcarts, where the hedgerows whisper secrets of long-forgotten seasons. The people who walked here were not warriors. They were sowers and bakers, shepherds and mothers. They woke before the sun and slept before the moon had risen high. They didn't dream of rebellion. They dreamed of a dry roof, of a loaf that would last through the week, of a child who would grow old. But dreams grow heavy when pressed beneath the weight of endless burdens. And in 1381, those burdens grew too heavy to bear. Imagine a country stretched thin, not only by war, but by plague, loss, and the slow erosion of trust. The Black Death, just a generation earlier, had halved the population. Whole villages had vanished, fields lay untended, and yet the demands did not lessen. The war in France still raged. The crown still needed coin, and so the poll tax returned, not once, but thrice. A tax that ignored poverty. That asked the same from a hungry widow as from a wealthy merchant. That knocked on every door with the same cold hand. By the third collection, something had changed, not in the tax, but in the people. Let us visit the town of Brentwood, in Essex. A quiet place, where thatched roofs leaned gently in the summer breeze, and chickens clucked through narrow lanes. When the royal commissioner arrived with his guards to enforce the tax, he expected submission. Instead, he was met with silence, then resistance. Villagers refused to answer. Some lied, some mocked the officials, and then a strike, a hand, a scuffle. It was small, local, but like a drop in still water it rippled. The ripples touched Kent, where men like Jack Straw began to organise. And from these two counties, connected by footpaths, rivers and frustration, a tide began to form. They were not soldiers, they were not uniformed, but they had something rarer in history. Shared experience, shared hunger, shared grief. And so they walked, past hedges and abbeys, through forests and over hills. One village joined, then another. Some brought staffs, others kitchen knives or nothing at all. Their banner, a simple cause, enough. They marched not to destroy, but to be heard, to be acknowledged as human beings with limits. And then they reached London, the capital, stone-clad and walled, thick with the smoke of forges and the scent of river tides, did not repel them. The gates, in fact, opened, and here the story slows, because what happened in those days was not a riotous storm. It was a strange stillness, peasants walking the halls of power, ordinary men standing in palace courtyards, looking nobles in the eye. Wat Tyler, calm, articulate, with a sense of unexpected presence, led the discussions. He asked not for riches but for release, freedom from serfdom, fair rent, and the right to work for wages. He was not rabble, he was reason. By his side stood John Ball, a priest long excommunicated for sermons that asked dangerous questions. "Are we not all children of God?" he asked. "Is one man's soul more golden than another's?" These were not slogans. They were quiet, ancient questions, now given breath. And then the moment broke. At Smithfield, during a tense negotiation, Wat Tyler was struck down. Accounts vary, some say by the Mayor of London, others by royal guards. The king, barely 14 years old, acted quickly. He calmed the crowd. He promised reform. And for a moment it seemed a new order might rise. But in the days that followed, the promises melted like mist. The leaders were arrested or killed. Villages were punished, and the old rhythms returned. Yet, not completely. You see, what the revolt showed, softly but clearly, was that the common people had voice, that beneath the weight of centuries of silence something could stir, not a fire but a pulse, a recognition of dignity. Serfdom in England would decline in the decades that followed, slowly, unevenly, but surely. And for every tax collector who came after, there was now a memory behind every door. A quiet question in every glance. What if we said no, again? It wasn't shouted, it didn't need to be. The roads remembered. The hedgerows, silent witnesses to rebellion, rustled the same. And England breathed in and waited for the next whisper. The Domesday Book mystery, how a tax record became England's greatest historical source. Now let us turn the page. From the tension of revolt to something quieter, older, more methodical. Imagine yourself seated at a wooden table in the year 1086. The air is still. Outside, the muffled sound of hooves, the distant toll of a church bell. But in here, inside this modest chamber lit by tallow candles, the only sound is the slow scratch of a quill across parchment. You are one of many scribes working under royal commission. Your task? To record line by line the details of an entire kingdom. This is the Domesday Book. And though it sounds like myth, it was in truth a very real and very practical document. Commissioned by William the Conqueror 2 decades after his victory at Hastings, the Domesday Survey was no grand artistic venture. It was, in essence, a nationwide tax audit, but what it became was far more. Let us begin with its name, Domesday, not doomsday in the apocalyptic sense, but in the Old English sense of judgment, the final reckoning. It was said that the survey was as binding and final as the Last Judgment itself. Once written, nothing could be disputed. And so, from shire to shire, teams of royal officials moved out across the landscape. They visited every manor, every village, every tract of land. They recorded who owned what, how many ploughs were in use, how many pigs, how many slaves, how many fish ponds, how much woodland, how many hides of arable soil. Each place was described 3 times: how it was in the time of King Edward, before the conquest, how it was when William took the crown, and how it stood now in 1086. And all of it, with a single goal, to know what could be taxed and how much. But here is where the mystery begins. Because though it was a tax document, the Domesday Book was never used, as far as we know, for actual tax collection. Not directly. It was filed away, preserved, revered, and it survived when so much else did not. Even today, nearly 1,000 years later, it rests in the National Archives in England, a window into the medieval world, as vivid and precise as if the quill were still wet. And yet there are gaps. Some counties are missing. Large populous areas, like London, Winchester and the far north, were left out entirely. Perhaps the records were lost, or never completed. No one knows for sure. There is also the curious uniformity. Despite being gathered by many hands across many places, the entries follow a strict formula, so consistent, so careful, that it raises the question: who oversaw its editing? Who held the final copy in their hands before it was bound? The Domesday Book is not a single book, but 2 volumes, Great Domesday and Little Domesday. The latter, covering Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex, is more detailed, more personal. Some say it was the trial run, a more elaborate version, abandoned for a simpler template once the sheer scale of the task became clear. But what's most mysterious is the tone. For such a monumental effort, there is almost no commentary, no opinions, no royal declarations, just facts, lists, measurements. It is as if the entire kingdom was distilled into numbers and names, and left to speak for itself. And what it says is haunting, that there were tens of thousands of slaves in England at the time, that most people owned nothing, that forests were measured not in trees but in how many pigs could feed on fallen acorns, that power, true power, was counted in hides of land, mills and oxen, and behind it all one man's will, William the Conqueror. He wanted to know what he ruled, and he wanted no argument about it, so he counted everything. In that sense, the Domesday Book is less a ledger and more a mirror held up to a newly conquered land where everything had changed, but daily life carried on, slow and stubborn as ever. A child born in a village then, say in Lincolnshire or Devon, might never hear of the book, but their name, or their father's name, or their land might be listed forever in its pages, and so from tax form to time capsule, from a king's command to a nation's memory. And tonight, as you lie still, consider that in the silence of archives and vaults, the Domesday Book still waits, still whispers, still holds the rhythm of medieval England within its fading ink. The bishop's taxes versus the king's, who paid what and why everyone hated both. Now let us drift to another corner of the medieval world, a quieter yet no less complex realm. Not a battlefield, not a marketplace, but a ledger room, perhaps within a stone abbey, or tucked behind the gates of a bishop's estate. Here, under the dim light of horn-covered windows, parchment scrolls are unrolled, the sound of sand sifting across ink, and 2 very different kinds of taxes being quietly tallied. In medieval England there was not just one hand reaching into the pockets of the people, there were 2, and sometimes more. The king demanded his due, but so too did the church, and this division between crown and crozier meant that peasants, tradesmen and landholders alike found themselves caught between earthly power and heavenly authority. Let us start with the king. Royal taxes were wide and varied. There were gelds, or land taxes, often inherited from earlier Anglo-Saxon systems. There were tallages, demanded from towns or estates. There were scutage payments, money paid in lieu of military service, and aids, collected during royal weddings or the knighting of princes. But most of all, there were ad hoc levies, rushed reactionary taxes created when the crown needed funds quickly. A war in France, a ransom for a captured king, a new castle on the border, and suddenly collectors were on the move again, ledgers in hand. Yet these taxes, as burdensome as they were, came from something concrete: the defence of the realm, the authority of the monarch. Church taxes, however, belonged to another world entirely. The church did not fight battles in the same way, though it often financed them. It did not build walls, though it owned vast estates. But it taxed nonetheless, with just as much precision and often with even greater reach. There was the tithe, the most famous. 1/10 of one's produce paid to the church, not just coins, but every 10th sheaf of wheat, every 10th lamb, apple, or egg. The tithe was supposed to be spiritual, a sign of gratitude. But in practice it was enforced, and those who failed to pay were not only fined, but sometimes excommunicated. Then there were Peter's pence, a tax collected across England and sent all the way to Rome. There were church court fines, fees for indulgences, charges for baptisms, marriage licenses and burial rites. Even death carried a fee. And what makes this web so heavy is that the two systems, royal and ecclesiastical, did not coordinate. You might pay your royal collector in spring, your tithe in summer, a church fee in autumn, and a war tax again before winter. There were moments, recorded in dusty annals, when these obligations overlapped so tightly that families were left with nothing. One entry tells of a widow in Sussex forced to give up her last goose, first to the reeve for rent, then to the tithe barn for God. And yet few dared complain aloud. To challenge the king was treason. To challenge the church was heresy. So people paid, or hid what they could, or lied, or ran quietly disappeared. We have records, just glimpses, of whole villages abandoning their lands, of thatched roofs left to collapse beneath the moss, of ledgers stamped deserted. But even among the authorities there was tension. The church argued that its lands were sacred, beyond the king's reach. Bishops and abbots refused royal taxes. Kings in turn seized church revenues during crises, prompting bitter disputes. Some monarchs, like Henry II, clashed violently with the church. Others, like Henry VIII, would eventually dissolve the monasteries altogether. But that's a later story, for another night. In the medieval centuries we drift through now, most people lived with both shadows, crown and cowl. They bowed to both, paid both, feared both. And often, when taxes were heaviest, it was hard to say who was worse. The king's men might take your silver, the bishop's men might take your soul, and as always, the quiet ones, the peasants and craftsmen, just kept working, kept planting, kept baking. They did not write the ledgers, but they filled them, and in doing so they built the kingdom, not with gold, but with quiet endurance. And now, as we leave behind the dusty scrolls and candlelit tables, let us breathe once more. The medieval world, so often told through swords and saints, is also a world of ledgers, ink, and uneasy silence. The story of taxes is not dramatic, it is not glamorous, but it is true. It shaped the way people lived, the way they feared, and the way they hoped. Behind every noble castle a tax collector walked. Behind every monastery a ledger waited, and behind every door someone counted what they could give and what they must hide. Tonight we've walked in their footsteps, slowly, quietly, with an open ear to the stories history rarely rushes to tell. And as the world around you quiets, let your mind drift gently from this past. No more quotas, no more cold morning rides, only the calm hush of sleep. Thank you for travelling with us, and good night.